Welcome to part 3 of my series on drawing the Mid Sodor Railway engines. In part 1 I drew numbers 5, 6 and 7 of the MSR, and in part 2 I drew the original 5, 6 and 7 that came before them. In this video I'm covering the last 3 engines featured on Audrey's Mid Sodor layout. The odds and ends, if you will. So, here we go. Alfred's model was depicted using a Mini Trains Baldwin 040 saddle tank. Whilst I wanted to keep the idea of him being a Baldwin, the exact type of engine that the model is based on seemed a bit modern for my needs. Given that Alfred was the original number 4 before Stuart's arrival, I wanted an engine that existed in the late 19th century, and after extensive searching it seems that, whilst I could easily find engines that resembled the Mini Trains model, the design of Baldwin 040 saddle tank with the tank covering the engine's smokebox as well as the boiler seemingly wasn't a thing until the early 1900s. Earlier Baldwin saddle tanks had the tank covering the boiler and only the boiler, so that's the design I've used for Alfred. We don't know what colour Alfred or Atlas were. There's only one publicly available photo of the two engines, and it's in black and white. However, it does appear that they are not painted black. In the end I went with a sort of burgundy or maroon colour scheme. Prior to the Mid Sodor's final lineup of engines, if you like, Jerry took the horse and cart, whereas the boat train was handled by John and Jennings. However, we don't know who was responsible for pulling the parliamentary before Albert's arrival on the railway. I figured that Alfred could be tasked with pulling the service. Here I've drawn him pulling a pair of Tycoon styled coaches and a guards van, as is accurate to the parliamentary's consist on Audrey's model layout. Before arriving on the Mid Sodor Railway, Alfred worked at a gold mine in Colorado, and was quite taken aback when he discovered that he'd be pulling passenger trains following his arrival on Sodor. Nevertheless, he was eager to give his new job a go. As he'd primarily been a shunter up until this point, his first attempts at pulling passenger trains were pretty terrible. Due to his small wheelbase, he bounced and lurched a lot when in motion, and he would often stop at and start from stations in quite an aggressive manner. For a while afterwards he worked at the various mines served by the Mid Sodor, and whilst that put him in his comfort zone, Alfred was very harsh on himself for not pulling the parliamentary very well on his first try. After negotiations with the railway's manager, he was allowed to pull the parliamentary again every so often, getting better and better each time before eventually he became the preferred engine for the service. Alfred headed the parliamentary for many years, but by 1920 it had become quite worn out. Alfred gracefully retired from the parliamentary service, and a certain other engine beginning with Al took his place. And so, here we have the finished drawing. The Reverend's model of Atlas used the same Mini Trains Baldwin body as Alfred, but with an 060 chassis and a coal bunker, or possibly an additional side tank, in front of the cab. I struggled to find a Baldwin 060 saddle tank engine with the tank covering the smoke box as well as the boiler, so once again I've given this engine an exposed smoke box, although I have retained the coal bunker or side tanks in front of the cab. Atlas was the Mid Sodor's number 8 and, as far as anyone knows, was the Mid Sodor's only number 8. Audrey also never made any mention of when he was withdrawn or sold off. This means you can put him pretty much anywhere in the railway's timeline, since he was neither replaced nor a replacement for another engine. He may have still been on the railway when it downsized in 1936, and, although unlikely, he may have even been around during the lean years up until 1947 when the railway closed. The original Atlas model wasn't assigned to a specific role on the timetable, it was simply there to act as a spare in case one of the other models stopped working. As a nod to this, I've decided to make Atlas a utility engine, always ready to fill in for another engine if they're unavailable, or to carry out tasks on short notice. The fact that Atlas could do basically any job on the railway got to his smokebox. He considered himself to be indispensable, and would often brag to the other engines about how important he was to the functioning of the railway. As far as Atlas was concerned, he was carrying the weight of the railway on his proverbial shoulders. Often this would motivate the engines to keep working for as long as they could without breaking down, just so that Atlas wouldn't get to leave the shed. Accidents were still liable to happen on the Mid Sodor, however, and Atlas was generally the engine that would be tasked with taking the breakdown gang to the scene of the incident. Pictured here on the passing loop is one of Stanley's many derailments, and his driver and fireman are giving him a right telling off. Luckily, Atlas is here with the breakdown train to get Stanley back on track. I wanted to experiment a bit with the setting of this scene, so I've shown a river flowing beside the line. Whether this is the River Arl or the Howin Ab is up to interpretation. I don't know if there were any willow trees near the Mid Sodor, but I like them. I think they're neat. I think this drawing is probably the closest I've got to nailing the Edwards illustration style so far, due to the amount of things going on in the scene. With all that said, here is the completed image. Whilst technically not a Mid Sodor engine, I would be remiss if I didn't make a segment covering this little locomotive. Audrey had two models of the mine engine, both of which were Decauville 040 tanks built by Juef, with the cab removed. Despite this, I've decided to base my take of the mine engine on the George England 040 tank, like Duke, albeit in original condition. I haven't changed the basis just for the sake of it, there is a reason, but we'll get to that when we get to it. I definitely heard a headcanon going around that the mine engine could be a small England, possibly related to the other popular headcanon that the mine engine could also be Bertram. This isn't the route I'm taking, even though I do think it's a fun idea. The mine engine was never given a name or a gender, which means I can choose them myself. The lack of a name could be evidence that the Casnahawen Mining Company has less of a personal relationship with their engines than the Mid Sodor Railway, or indeed any of Sodor's other railways. There is some evidence that the mine engine once belonged to the Mid Sodor Railway, since her first model had a number. Possibly she was sold to the Casnahawen Mining Company to make a bit of extra money. So here's my crazy idea for the mine engine. I am going to make one slight alteration to what we know of her already, but hopefully you can let me off. The mine engine's first model indicated that she was the Mid Sodor Railway's number 9. But what if she was actually the original number 2? There had to have been one before Stanley came along. Now let's go back to the basis I've given her, the small Englands. The Festiniog Railway's number 1 and number 2 were engines of this type, called Princess and Prince respectively. You might have caught on to where I'm going with this. Duke is obviously analogous to Prince, but perhaps, like his Welsh analogue, he had a twin. So, My take on the mine engine is that she was originally a Mid Sodor Railway engine called Duchess, and both she and Duke arrived on the Mid Sodor Railway in time for its opening in 1880. At that point in time, the small Englands were not saddle tank engines like they are now. Instead, they were side tank engines but had cast iron weights above the tanks, giving them the appearance of a saddle tank engine. Of course, Duke was rebuilt with saddle tanks, but Duchess never was for one reason or another. The two engines worked happily together for many years, but by around 1910, Duchess had seen better days. The Catz Mining Company needed an engine of their own, so the Mid Sodor Railway sold them their worst condition engine, that's Duchess if you've just joined us, at a knockdown price so that they could have her worn parts mended. Upon arrival at the mining company, she had the cast iron weight above her tanks removed, allowing her to run on less durable track. She also had her tender removed, as she would only be travelling short distances, although it may have been kept around for when she had to make trips beyond the mining complex. Part of Duchess misses her life as a passenger engine on the Mid Sodor Railway, and it can get quite lonely up in the mines, but she also appreciates the relative peace and quiet compared to the hustle and bustle of her old job. "Lead ore might not be as glamorous as passengers," she would say, "but I've never heard it complain, and that's got to count for something." Although Duke was sorry to say goodbye to his sister, he didn't let it get to him too much. At any rate, whenever the two engines met at Catz, they'd always make sure to whistle hello to each other and exchange news, time permitting. Nobody is quite sure of what happened to the engine formerly known as Duchess following the flooding of the Catz mine and subsequent closure of the Mid Sodor Railway. We can hope that the mine engine has moved on to greener pastures. But with that said and done, here is the illustration complete. And there you have it, the final part of the Mid Sodor saga complete. It's been a lot of fun and quite a challenge coming up with backstories for all 9 engines, and I hope you've enjoyed watching this 3-parter as much as I've enjoyed making it. I want to give a shout out to the video Mid Sodor Mysteries by Explosive Cookie, since it's been a great resource for me during the making of these videos, not to mention it's just a really entertaining and well put together video in its own right. It's time for me to start drawing other Thomas related things. Be sure to comment down below and subscribe if you want to see what I've got in store for next time.